to happen.
Well, let's face it. I mean, I've had it twice in the last 2 months.
Yeah, we've had large numbers of staff off ill with COVID, more in the last month than we've really had before, apart from a peak just before Christmas. So this
One of the scientists said, yeah, it was great what they did, but the one thing they shouldn't have got rid of was the mask wearing. That's the one best protection.
Well, I have to say that, okay, I wasn't going to share that I was on holiday last week, but I was on holiday last week, and I was in Gran Canaria, and I flew back on Thursday night.
Now I'm jealous.
I'm sorry about that. But what really shocked me, so in the whole of Spain, everyone wears masks. You wouldn't even dream of going into a shop without a mask. And actually, even walking down the street, half the people wear masks. Obviously, in the airport, you had to wear a mask. They all got on the plane. I couldn't work it out because everyone, as they got on the plane, took their mask off. And I was one of 5 people that remained wearing a mask. And Jet2.com, there are other airlines, announced that they were now a mask-free airline.
Well, my sister just flown to Australia through 3 different airlines, and every single one she had to keep the mask on.
Airline, I mean, it's all regurgitated. That's a better word than regurgitate. Recycled air. So if there's any bug anywhere on the plane, anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight. And I haven't included any photographs of beaches, sunshine, or rain, actually, for that matter. So what I thought when I was thinking about this is an incredible amount has actually happened over the last 2 years. You only have to look up, put pandemic milestones into Wikipedia, and every year has about 30 pages of milestones, almost day by day what happened. And obviously, we can't go through all of those tonight. So what I thought I would do was put together a presentation that was almost a reminder of what's happened over 2 years, and then actually hopefully get time for a proper discussion and reflection, rather than just, this is what happened. Thanks very much indeed for coming. I'm going to begin with this image, and I'll come back to it at the end, because actually when I was thinking over the last week or 2 about how to put together this presentation, I personally did an awful lot of soul searching. You know, on frequent occasions, we've had to make really big decisions. And because we were making decisions that affected our tenants and our staff, there were consequences of those decisions. And actually, almost inevitably, you know, we made one set of decisions. There could have been other variants of the same decisions with different outcomes. So my soul searching was really, did we make, based on what we knew at the time, the best decisions we could have made, given what we knew at the time and who we were and where we were? So that has actually been quite an interesting strand for me thinking about this over the last week or 2. I put in this rather depressing slide, which is less depressing than the next slide, maybe, just to remind ourselves of what a unique set of circumstances we've been through in the last 2 years. And I'll come back to that a bit later. But the reality is that I don't think any of us, to my knowledge, have lived through a set of circumstances that we've had in the last 2 years, with national lockdowns, with daily counts on the news about how many people have contracted COVID, how many people have sadly passed away from COVID. And that very, very steep curve that we began with back almost exactly 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. But it hasn't gone away, and that's why I said the story so far. So this slide is the data from yesterday. So the cumulative total so far is just over 21.5 million people, so almost 1 in 3, I guess, of the UK population have had COVID. And we're now over 170,000 people have lost their lives to COVID. And even yesterday, okay, weekends, you had the catch up, don't you? But 348 people had their deaths reported yesterday, compared to only 210 deaths reported a week before. So it definitely hasn't gone away. It is still here. Now, as I just mentioned, there's about an up to numbers of Wikipedia page going through the milestones. And so 23rd of March 2 years ago, UK first lockdown. Then we got a second lockdown on the 31st of October. Then we got our third lockdown on the 4th of January. And actually, it was interesting. The 4th of January lockdown last year, it wasn't until middle of April before non-essential retail opened, and it wasn't until July that the remaining restrictions. And actually, I don't know about you, but Groundhog Day has happened an awful lot in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
You know, it's lovely to be in the round as opposed to hiding behind a Perspex screen. It's lovely to see people face to face as opposed to looking at different people on the same computer screen in the same environment. And actually, when you think about the implications, which I'll come back to again, if I remember, on people's mental health for the last 2 years, it's the feeling of isolation and loneliness, the feeling of frustration, particularly people who were living in very far from ideal circumstances. And so it's just us remembering that this has been an amazing couple of years with a huge set of so we've almost been bombarded with bits of depressing news almost every day. I know, for example, quite early on in 2020, I gave up watching the 10 o'clock news. I actually went to Channel 4 News at 7 o'clock, but I actually worked out that if I watched the 10 o'clock news, I went to bed thinking about all these ghastly things, and actually the quality of my sleep went downhill as a result. And I think even those people who aren't aware that there's been an impact on mental health and sense of well-being, there has been for nearly everybody. So before the pandemic, you know, so we like to think that we were really, really well prepared for whatever might turn up. And funny enough, I remember sitting in the room next door from here in the January of 2020, where we went through and checked all our business continuity plans. And you've got a good list there on the right of all the business continuity events that we thought of. You know, a member of staff or one of our non-exec board members gets arrested. The death of a tenant under negligent circumstances, the death of an employee due to health and safety failure, safeguarding failures. All the staff decide that they're fed up and go on strike. A significant fraud, a contractor building something for us or maintaining something for us goes bust. We get hit by a cyber attack. I mean, Flagship got hit by a really severe cyber attack. And I think 3 or 4 years later, they're not out of it yet. Data breach happens, or we have a business systems failure. Now, what you might notice of that really comprehensive list is we didn't have pandemic and we didn't have a national lockdown, but about 8 weeks after we agreed these and said, aren't we well prepared, these turned up. And these are the news headlines on the morning of the 24th of March of 2 years ago, where we entered what, I can't think which paper it is. It's the Sun called House Arrest, Daily Mail Lockdown Britain. You know, fundamental change to how you were going to operate. You know, I don't think any of us have lived through circumstances where a prime minister said at 8 o'clock on a Monday evening, you now have to stay at home. For as long as we want you to stay at home, but you're not allowed to go out. And if you do go out, you can go out for one bit of exercising every day. And if you get in your car, it's got to be for an essential purpose. You know, the idea that 2 of you might get in your car to go to Tesco's, no, that wasn't going to happen. And I remember the first time I got in the car, which is probably about 3 or 4 weeks after lockdown. Basically, I wanted to go over to Borswell, I live in Elmham, because I needed the gas cylinder. And I was really worried I was going to be stopped by the police, who were going to ask me whether it was essential I had this gas cylinder. Actually, I passed the police car, they didn't stop me. But it was really strange, that whole period. Now, going back to the night before those headlines, here is images that I trapped from the video, because actually there does exist a video, I checked it yesterday, of a meeting, our second leadership group meeting that happened on the 23rd. We had one at 10 o'clock in the morning because we'd already closed the offices the week before. We already recognised that this was something that was going to happen to keep people safe. And then the Prime Minister spoke at 8 o'clock. I think all of us who actually were not in this room now, Catherine's away on holiday and Linda's retired since then. Yeah, I'm not making any comment, Gloria. But we got online at 9 o'clock. We met at 9 o'clock. And I think we met till about 11:15, because we were absolutely convinced that we had to issue guidance to our staff team the next morning. We didn't want anybody not knowing what they were supposed to be doing. And I have to say, it was a really good example, I think, of where we worked with urgency. I mean, the fact that Mr. Savage keep referring to the number of glasses of wine, and I'm not saying he made more sense, far from it, actually. But there had to be that sort of sense of humour about it as well. And I think, but it was a really good example of where the team worked really well. Now, what our priorities were, we concluded very quickly, they were people-focused priorities. You know, our priority was to support people to be able to live in their homes. If you're going to be trapped in your home for the next X number of weeks and we don't know how long, we needed to make sure that we provided the right services that actually enable people to be reasonably comfortable. We wanted to make sure that we worked with our partners, worked with our local authority partners, because obviously there are an awful lot of people, and I'll come back to this again later, who were in dire housing circumstances, many people who were rough sleeping, and actually what contribution could we make to get people into somewhere that was safe and reasonably comfortable for them to spend lockdown. We felt it was really important we supported both staff and tenants who needed to shield. And, you know, we've had some staff who actually had to shield the whole way through the pandemic, almost 2 years. We felt it was fundamentally important that we did not expose anybody, whether they were staff or tenants, to unnecessary risks. So is it absolutely essential that we put somebody into somebody's home for such and such a repair? Well, actually, if it's not essential, why are we doing it? Because we're exposing both the tenant and we're exposing the member of staff. And obviously, in those first few weeks, particularly, staff were really concerned about what they might take home to their families. You have to remember, this is long before vaccinations. On my previous slide, I put the date of the first vaccination. I think it was sort of January of 21 or late December. And actually, it was really important that we kept our board members fully informed, fully engaged and influential, that they were able to exercise their responsibilities as the board of Broadland to make sure that we were doing the right things at the right time, because actually they were accountable and remain accountable for what we do. Breaking that down a little bit more, on our tenant-facing priorities, it was about minimising the risks that we expose people to, as I just mentioned. So focus on lifestyle compromising repairs. If it's not lifestyle compromising, in other words, making it difficult for somebody to live in their home, let's just put it off. Maintained our focus on gas safety, often difficult because actually if people were shielding, they didn't want us to go into their homes and doing a gas service. So can we reassure ourselves that it was safe not to do the gas service? As I put there, postpone non-essential repairs and of course plan maintenance, which could be investment in people's homes, new kitchens, new bathrooms, new windows. Focus on sanitisation. I was very tempted to put photographs of each member of the leadership group out there. Cleaning. I had to confess, I was very lucky in a funny sort of way, because I decided to do a sanitising shift every week. On a Thursday, I went to York Place in Dereham and then went on to Pavilion Way. And actually, it was brilliant for my own mental health. I was leaving the house. And secondly, I was able to talk to people. Okay, socially distanced. I got really good. Please don't tell Catherine, my wife, but I got really good at sanitising. I keep telling her there's a big difference between sanitising and cleaning. And actually, there's nothing about tidying up in sanitising either. I keep having to reassure her about this one. But the reality, it was great for me. And I think it was a privilege for all of us. Whenever there was a bank holiday weekend, the whole leadership team took shifts to ensure that our staff who were doing the cleaning normally were able to have a break. And that was really good. We made the very early decision that actually it was safe to carry on gardening, and actually ensuring the communal areas still looked reasonably good was quite important for people's own mental health. And we started telephoning tenants who we identified as potentially isolated. Actually, something I'll throw in here. Siobhan, who is unfortunately not able to be here tonight, mentioned to me that we keep talking about supporting vulnerable tenants. And she said, surely there is a better word than vulnerable, because people don't think of themselves as vulnerable. If you can think of that word, I came up here with potentially isolated tenants. But if we suspected somebody was going to be isolated, we tried to make contact, and we then gave the option, would you like us to carry on those conversations? And I have to say, quite a lot of Laura, you did some of the phoning, the befriending calls, and I think it was actually a rich experience for both the member of staff and hopefully the tenants who they were calling.
I don't think vulnerable is the right word, because
No.
I'm thinking a lot of, I say this as if I'm not one, a lot of pensioners who are just living on their own, actually suicide, but I'm good on the telephone. A phone call.
I think it's
makes a
isolated.
huge difference. Yeah.
It's identifying what circumstances might somebody be feeling lonely.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting how probably the sector falls into language, and actually it's not very helpful. But sometimes it's quite difficult to then find the right word that explains what you're trying to. It may well be the case that actually 10 words is better than one sometimes, as opposed to the other way around. On the board side, that I wouldn't have said this if Chris was in the meeting. Chris has been able to come this evening. We got this is a snap. In the old days when Teams could only show you 4 people at a time, so everybody else is at the bottom of the screen. And actually, we got incredibly familiar with Chris Eubank, he's our chair, his forehead. We saw an awful lot of his forehead. When we were interviewing that summer for new board members, one of the candidates observed to Linda, who was still working for us at that point, that he knew Chris's forehead really well, but didn't actually know what Chris looked like after the interview. So that was a common view. And actually, I did search desperately through this particular video of a board meeting that happened. I can't see where on the words there, but I couldn't find actually where we saw the whole of his head. But we also very quickly in the business analytics team and the digital team very quickly came up with a COVID dashboard for us that updated somewhere around 9:45, 10 o'clock every morning. So we knew where we stood on repairs, where we stood on arrears, how many tenants were telling us they'd moved over to UC because they lost their jobs, where we saw stuck on income collection, how many staff were able to work, how many staff had symptoms, etc., etc. And actually, for probably the first 3 months, that dashboard was absolutely essential. And back in this first, I think it was through to about June, July, the board was also meeting every Friday for an hour to go through the dashboard to find out from each of the directors what was going on in their area of the business. Was there anything that was coming down the line that we need to be worried about? Where were we on health and safety? Where were we on gas certificates? And it was really useful. And it actually proved the team could very quickly adapt our systems to give the board and actually us as directors the right information to hopefully make broadly the right decisions. And then looking after Broadland employees, I keep mentioning it was about avoiding unnecessary risks, investing in the right PPE. I'm not making any comment about UK government maybe investing in not the right PPE, but actually making sure that we were buying the right stuff that equipped staff to do their jobs. I've already mentioned supporting those that needed to shield. The move to home working, actually, I have to say that was a real success for us. We'd actually moved to home working for office-based staff the previous Thursday. And actually, the reality was we made the decision on the Thursday that we had to close our offices. And nearly every member of staff was able to work from home the next morning without massive disorganisation. In other words, because we had invested in these Surface machines, as long as a member of staff was able to access the internet, they were able to work. Now, actually, there were some staff, particularly our younger staff, who were in compromised housing conditions. You know, some people worked from their bedroom or even sitting on their bed for a period, which is far from ideal and not good for actual mental well-being. But it did prove that the infrastructure of the organisation had been so effectively invested in, not because we thought we were going to have a lockdown in the pandemic, that actually operationally we were operational the next day after closing our offices. The other thing, and I put it at the bottom there, and this was for both our staff and probably tenants as well, understanding the pressures of homeschooling. You know, I can think of one member of the team who actually since moved on, but he and his partner were sharing childcare responsibilities. So he was starting work at 5 o'clock in the morning on Broadland stuff, finishing, spending the time with the kids, and then picking all that stuff up in the evening. So adapting round, and actually it was when we sort of started putting on our footer. It may be convenient for me to send the message to you right now, but it might not be convenient to you to read it right now. So do it when it's right for you. And I think there was something there about people learning how to be flexible and how to allow other people to be flexible. You know, I remember you don't have to go back so long in the world of email to the point where somebody sends you an email, you open it, it's been sent 5 minutes before, and then they hurry up 10 minutes later that you haven't replied. Now, I'm old enough now to remember starting work in 1981, where I was surveying down in Kent, and a letter might come in from the client on a Monday, you would ponder the reply, get it typed, send it on the Tuesday, the client would receive it on the Wednesday or the Thursday, and you might get a reply on the Friday, but it might be the following Monday. And now we try to truncate all that into a matter of minutes or hours. And I think actually there are some good things about the pandemic in a funny sort of way. And one of them has been that people have learnt that people have different lifestyles, different expectations on them. And actually you can be flexible and fit in with each other. And actually, you don't need to have instantaneous answers on quite a lot of things.
We're more compassionate as well.
I think so. So on the right there, you can't read any of it, but this was the first communication that we sent out about midnight on the 23rd of March. So all staff logging in the morning had, I think it was about a 13-page document at that stage. So this is what's going on. This is our expectations of you. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to keep you safe. This is how we're keeping staff safe. And by the way, these are the symptoms of COVID, and this is a link to the NHS advice, etc., etc. And finishing with, there's going to be lots of scams. So just be aware of scams and just be cautious when clicking on links, etc., etc. And I think that was we kept that constantly up to date. The other thing that I thought was really fortunate actually is that probably a year before pandemic started, you know, I got so confused with time in the last couple of years. We actually identified that it would be really useful as an organisation to have mental health champions. And so we supported, I think, 7 members of staff to become mental health champions. We got them trained as mental health champions, and they independently support members of staff. We don't know as an organisation who they're supporting, but the mental health champions have come into their own over the last 2 years. Things like having all staff chat. Directors were not allowed to attend. No agenda, no round robins, nothing like that on a weekly basis. Advertising apps like that one I've got there, which is breathing techniques. And each month they produce this sort of calendar for the month about things that are good to do. And I think we were very, very fortunate. I mean, I'd say we're very fortunate. I think we got an extremely caring staff team. And the fact that they were so willing to not only care for our customers, our tenants, but actually care for and encourage each other was really, really important.
I was very pleased to see you do that.
I think it's
I
massively.
mean, it's something actually that, for the mental health art is something that is statutory anyway in all companies. Not that a lot of them do it.
No.
So I think that's
And I think it was quite important that people felt that there were people they could go and talk to that were outside, open inverted commas, the system, rather than just feeling isolated. And so actually that's what was so important about keeping people informed. You know, social media, Facebook, Twitter, the website. I have to say there is an issue for us as an organisation. I sometimes feel quite sorry for Paula and her team in that we want to communicate to all our tenants, but actually we can only send door to door to those that are willing for us to send door to door. So we have no avenue of sending a communication to everybody who is our tenant. We rely on them coming and pulling the information from Facebook or the website or Twitter. And that is really frustrating. It's one of the things, you know, when I joined Broadland 19 years ago, we could just send door to door. We knew a percentage of door to door copies went straight in the bin. We didn't have to have it coming out of the envelope, but that's okay because at least they got it and they could look at it if they wanted to. There is now no way that we're able to do that. And so that was actually one of our challenges. How do you tell all our customers that actually due to the pandemic, we're having to change the way we do things? In the end, there will always be a percentage who only found out there was a change when they phoned us because they wanted something. Yeah. And I would love to find a way around that. I haven't thought of it yet. We went to online community conversations, and actually they were really quite rich because rather than finding, you know, I remember pre-pandemic, just after Catherine arrived, we did a community conversation in Bodham in North Norfolk, and you had people that lived relatively close to Bodham, although actually I think a couple came from Elsham. But it was broadly people from that local area. Suddenly you have a community conversation online and you can have somebody who lives in Yarmouth, as we did, with somebody who lives in Heacham, talking about their different experiences, giving us learning points from across the organisation. And actually that was really good. And it proved that whilst face-to-face is really powerful and useful, and I never want to go away from face-to-face, actually also having the virtual made it easier for some people to engage with us. Someone's desperate, Gloria. Or it's an alarm to say, no, I'm really bored at this point. I need to say, oh, something's come up and I need to go home now.
I didn't think I get these loads of wonderful photographs. A friend of mine's out with a fantastic camera in the woods somewhere.
And they send them through.
Yes.
And then on staff communications. So whenever anything changed, that guidance notes change, and that guidance note is still changing. So there's always a current version of the guidance note for staff to look at. Video updates about what's going on. And we move.
I ask you a question, just based on a bit about the internal way of looking after staff and health. What about, you know, the likes of, I mean, I'm all right, but, you know, we, the tenants, how do we, I mean, I know myself, I mean, God, you know what chat box I am.
No.
At different times, if I've been really hit low with BME, there is a mental health issue.
Yeah.
Picking up the phone and talking to somebody, it's
We
really difficult.
did do the EAP equivalent.
Yeah, the IAP.
IAP. It wasn't hugely taken up because we were conscious of that. So we have this sort of third party organisation staff can talk to when they've got issues. So we actually did during the pandemic do a contract with an independent body, but actually very few tenants took it up. It's one of our challenges.
But is, for example, you know, if somebody rings up on the computer, does it flag up a bit about the person, the tenant? So it would say this person has maybe severe mental health.
Yeah.
So they treat it
Yeah.
differently. That's good. Good to know.
The last thing just on that slide, moving team briefs. So team brief is something that we've been doing for about 15 years, I suspect, actually, if not longer, Steph. Probably longer, yeah. And team brief used to be where a member of the executive team sits down with 6 to 8 members of staff. Well, actually, at one point we didn't have smaller numbers. I remember doing one in the boardroom in Carrow Road with 32 members of staff, which wasn't really a discussion; it was more a presentation. And we changed it so we actually have a manic week or two. Well, before the pandemic, we had a manic 2 weeks doing team briefs every 2 months, where each of us would sit down in separate groups with 6 to 8 members of staff to find out what's going on, but they had to come to us. We moved those onto online, and actually that's been really good. It's shown that there is again a learning point. There have been occasions where I've been talking to a group of 6 people, and 2 of them are parked in vans in laybys in various different parts of Norfolk, but they haven't had to have half a day cut out of their diary to spend some time hearing what's going on in the organisation. So we've tried to maintain that and do it in the new way. We, of course, it seems extraordinary. When I first started looking for this clip from Facebook, I thought it was July of 2020, and it was actually May 2020, which I thought was really interesting. I don't think any of us thought in May 2020 that almost 2 years later we would still be working in a pandemic conditions. And we were starting to think in May, so we're going to come out of this, we'll have a bit of a backlog. So we haven't done repairs for 6 or 7 weeks. We better do some rescheduling. And of course, we're still rescheduling today, almost 2 years later. But what was encouraging there was the investment of time many tenants took to help us shape our priorities if we actually had to come up with different timescales for different types of job, which were the most important, which actually could be left. And that's been extremely powerful. We've monitored how people felt. For tenants, we've done quarterly surveys. And for staff, we do a monthly survey. I should say, you can't see the scale on that. But whereas staff are the blue columns, it doesn't mean they're now at 2 out of 10. I think the bottom of that scale is 7 out of 10. So it's a scale between 7 and 8, really. But it's interesting seeing how people have got fed up. And because for staff, it's not an anonymous survey. We're very clear with them that we will know the result. So if somebody says they're really fed up, actually their line manager can follow that up and see what's going on. And an observation I will make, but interesting, I've got 2 children in their 20s working in London. I see the same thing. Young people below the age of 30 have been consistently more fed up than older people because we're all a bit more self-contained, actually. Whereas actually, you know, my son working from home in London, never seeing his colleagues, just working in his bedroom in a shared flat. Whereas, you know, before the pandemic, going to work was part of a social activity, and actually we might go into the pub after work and I'll pop out and have a sandwich at lunchtime, but I'll go with a couple of colleagues from work. And actually people in their 20s, I think, have consistently across the country felt more isolated and lonely than actually probably any of us thought of at the time.
It's a generational thing.
Yeah.
Because one of the best piece of advice I ever had from my friend I think about when I was very active in politics and everything. And he said to me, Richard, put yourself about, but remember to make the opposite to loneliness, the word now, solitude, your
Yeah.
friend. And I always did.
Yeah.
And that stood me in good
Yeah.
stead. And the younger generation, I think, in the computer age are very much.
Yes. But it's interesting, you know, my parents-in-law are moving to a little retirement bungalow in Swanton Morley, and I was there cutting the grass on Sunday, but they haven't moved up yet. Saturday, talking to their neighbour for the first time, and she's lived on the scheme for 3.5 years, and said how lonely she felt during the pandemic because they were all told that they weren't allowed to go into each other's homes, and there were no activities taking place in the communal lounge at all for the first 18 months. And, you know, she's 88. And she was saying, well, I might not be here next birthday. I might have missed my opportunity to just have a natter with. And I thought there's some things that we've really got to trap in hindsight when we get through this and work out how we are able, as individuals as well as organisations, but how we as individuals can take responsibility to ensure that people don't feel isolated and lonely and on their own. It is my link to COVID and housing with care. Potentially, I think you could say that our residents in our housing with care schemes have been at the most risk of COVID. And of course, we don't provide care. We've worked very closely with North. We've had the number of messages that appear on Teams from Steph saying, I have to advise you that such and such a scheme is now in lockdown, or such and such a scheme is in lockdown, or whatever, because COVID is now present in the scheme, has been a really, you know, it's been depressing situation over the year. We have, partly as a result, but not exclusively as a result, had quite a lot of empty flats throughout the pandemic. But actually there's some underlying issues as well. So we are doing a strategic review because we absolutely know that our housing with care schemes are exactly the right schemes for certain people to live in, and it's not getting through. And I think actually, if you've been resident in one of those schemes during the pandemic, you wouldn't have felt isolated. So we've just got to ensure that we maximise the community benefit going forward of 8 housing with care schemes across the county. And they are across the county, they're not all concentrated in one location.
So what exactly, what was that? Is it where flats?
It's sort
are
of
in
independent living within a scheme.
Within the scheme, yeah.
The flats are relatively small. They've got a sort of living room, kitchen, a bedroom and a wet room bathroom.
Yeah.
But they're almost on internal streets. So they are internal. Outside of Norwich, they all have access to garden space from their flat. It's only in Norwich where we had to go 2-storey, or actually in Belrose 3-storey, which obviously doesn't work in the same way. I think they're fantastic places.
Yeah, my ex-husband's in one and it's brilliant.
They are brilliant. So we just need to make sure that we are maximising the benefit to the county and to people living in this county from that investment, because it's a huge investment if you think about each of those schemes. It's a lot of money that's wound up in those schemes, and it's very frustrating. I haven't looked at the number of empty flats today, but I suspect it's somewhere around 55, 56 across the 8 schemes. And that's really frustrating because we absolutely know they're fit for purpose for some people. And actually, I suspect many of those some people end up going into residential care instead of housing with care, when actually they could have they could still have their independence for a while longer.
I'm amazed at that, because when he had a stroke, we did go into disciplinary care to start with. He did it.
Yeah.
And then we found out there were these kind of flats, and we were bloody lucky because one came up.
But it's the number of empties that we have. Saffron have exactly the same problem, without going off into a complete distraction, which of course I can easily do. What's interesting, I think you're aware that we're in the Independent East group, so we've got 5 housing associations that work together.
No, I didn't know.
All right, so it's us. We established it. I should have put a slide in about it actually, because I think it's been one of the successes of the pandemic. So it's us, Saffron, Freebridge and Norfolk, Orwell and Havebury in Suffolk. And actually, the slide I would have put in is right on that first week of lockdown, the chief execs have met for an hour every week. Obviously, not all of us every time, because we might be doing other things, every week ever since, and really shared information. And one of the interesting things, because we're now benchmarking against each other, is us and Saffron have exactly the same problem. Actually, Saffron's a bit worse on housing with care, but Orwell don't in Suffolk. So there's something system different in Suffolk that Norfolk needs to learn. And that's really powerful information. I'm using far too much time speaking, which is careless. Everybody in homelessness, absolutely big priority. I think everybody knows that we're members of Homes for Kathy. We've been involved with Homes for Kathy for 6 years. Homes for Kathy, right? Sorry, I should never make assumptions. What is it? Assumptions make an ass of you and me. So Homes for Kathy was formed in 2016. Initially, it was about the 50th anniversary of the BBC broadcasting Kathy Come Home.
Yeah.
On the 16th of
Yes.
November 1966.
Yeah.
And we felt, as a group then of about
Yeah.
22 housing associations that were all formed in the 60s or early 70s, we should mark the anniversary because homelessness hadn't gone away. The reality is Shelter and Crisis were both 50 years old about the same time. And neither of those organisations thought they would still exist 50 years later because we would have solved as a country homelessness. And of course we haven't. So we in 2016, early 2017, made this marked this anniversary, culminating in taking the homelessness drama group Cardboard Citizens to perform a version of Kathy set in 2016 in the House of Lords for parliamentarians, MPs and members of the House of Lords. And on the same day as we had that event, we sat across the square in a building and discussed the future and said, so is this it? We said, well, we've done it now. We'll come back together in another 49 years' time to mark it the 100th. Or actually, is homelessness such a disaster? We should actually open ourselves up and become a lobbying group. So we decided down the second route, and we now have 115 housing associations in Homes for Kathy. And we have a board, which I'm one of the board members, and there's 5 housing associations on the board and Crisis. So Crisis are a shareholder in Homes for Kathy. And in 2017-18, we developed 9 commitments and said, right, with Crisis, if you're a Homes for Kathy member, we expect you to be working on some of these commitments, ideally all of them. And I think I'm proud to say that Broadland does work on all of them. And things like not evicting people into homelessness, working with people. And, you know, it's one of the interesting things is we no longer, unless somebody is really determined not to engage with us, we do not evict people for arrears, but we find a way to keep them in their home.
Yeah.
Interestingly, our arrears are some of the lowest we've had in years, even though we've taken away a key tool from the rent recovery team, the income collection team, by saying, but we don't want to evict people. So it's worked. One of the aspirations I had a couple of years ago was actually we would get, well, more than a couple of years ago, because a couple of years ago in the pandemic, 3 or 4 years ago, is that we could get Norfolk aligned to actually try to eradicate homelessness in Norfolk. And actually before the pandemic, that was an impossible pipe dream. Back in 2020, very quickly, we started getting groups together into Teams calls or Zoom calls. And in the autumn of 2020, we established the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership. And the Norfolk Strategic Housing Partnership has all the local authorities, so both county and all district and borough local authorities. It has DWP, it has Ministry of Justice, police and crime commissioners, it's got the police, it's got the NHS, it's got mental health NHS, and it's got a number of housing associations, and we've got Shelter on the group. And in fact, the current chair is the Chief Executive of Norwich City Council, and I'm currently the Vice Chair. It would, you know, the idea that I could get everybody, 20 odd organisations in one virtual room, of course, all signing up to eradicating homelessness in Norfolk was a pipe dream. And actually, we've been through a period where it wasn't a pipe dream. I think the challenge now as we get near to the end, perhaps maybe, of a pandemic and life becomes normal, is how do we keep people focused on that ambition? Right now, we're in a relatively good place, and there's a homelessness forum that sits underneath that, which has got housing associations involved in. Katie Doherty represents Broadland, but it's also got a Shelter, it's got mental health charities, it's got lots of third sector organisations all contributing to that. For us, very quickly, there was a discussion about, so in fact, I remember chairing the discussion before the partnership, is we can't have every housing association knocking on the door of every local authority. You know, we could be much more organised. And we had this call, I think, Andrew, were you on the call? Where we said, let's pair ourselves off. And actually, we paired with Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, Norwich and Great Yarmouth. And as a result of that, we've been engaged with all of those organisations. finding housing solutions and actually putting our money where our mouth is and delivering them. And we've also got what 3.6 million pounds of capital investment out of the rough sleeping accommodation programme funding, together with about 840,000 of revenue support. We've also worked with the MOJ to provide prison leavers accommodation, because actually you don't have to go back very long. I went out with Pathways probably 3 or 4 years ago now on a July morning, and prison leavers out of Norwich were being given sleeping bags and asked to check in with probation. And surprise, surprise, a lot of them failed to actually establish themselves outside. And I spent a lot of time with a young guy who thought his only option 5 days after being released was actually to commit a crime to feel safe and secure again.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to try to show you a quick, it's a 28-second video, and I hope, Mary, it works for you, of a scheme that Andrew built near County Hall just a few months ago, just before Christmas. And it's not streaming. It's streaming on my computer. Is it streaming on yours, Mary?
Oh, here we go.
Oh,
Yeah.
there it goes.
Yes.
I'll
yes,
leave it to
is.
loop a little bit. It's only a 24-second, and
Yeah,
it just,
yeah,
this was a
yeah.
scheme of 6 flats that actually went up in 3 days. Okay, we'd done the groundwork. So
Yeah,
there had been a
yeah.
little bit of work, but it actually demonstrated what could be done where there was a will, there was a way.
Oh,
And it's going to
nice.
loop round.
Anglia News.
Yeah,
was on
yeah,
your-
Andrew was.
Yeah, it was Look East. It was in Look East, wasn't it? Mm.
Have you ever thought, you know, I mean, these prefab houses that are fantastic, not like,
Oh, well, we've done, and we're doing some more now.
yeah,
But these are prefabs. They were
Yeah.
built in, they were actually manufactured in Birmingham, Warwickshire. And it just shows what could be done where there's a real commitment.
Started it, we procured it all the way through the lockdowns as well, so it was quite an interesting.
Can you hear, Mary?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
design
You hear
build,
me?
Make sure the factory's okay, make sure the quality's all right. We've done this before where we didn't quite hit the quality button on it, and so we learned off that an awful lot. And so it's the second attempt at modular, so that's called modular housing basically. And it's the same specification that we would put into the key that we're putting up at the moment, exactly the same thermal ability and very energy efficient. And the great thing about, you'll hear about circular economy in the future, where you can reuse. So basically, we can strip it back down and move it.
Yeah.
The one thing I do like is the flooring. When properties become empty,
Yeah.
That's it.
I think it's time that we looked at putting in a sustainable flooring.
yes, because it's a hell of an expense.
All units.
The voice standard is something we've got to look at. And the trouble is we have to look at within the context of financial resources, which I'll come back to. I'm aware it's already, I think we said it was going to be over by 7. I'm not sure I'm going to make that.
My tax is coming at 7.
Well, Richard, let me try to speed up. I'm going to speed up and speak very fast. And if you don't catch my words, we'll have to watch it back on the video later on, slow it down. So one of the things, this slide is about refocusing our strategic ambitions. And actually this sort of picks up on the point James is making. So we agreed a corporate strategy in June 2019, which I thought was a wonderful corporate strategy. We've done all sorts of consultation where we worked out that this was going to be a fantastic 4-year window, and then a pandemic came along. In April 2020, the board suspended the corporate strategy and we agreed a 6-month corporate strategy because, of course, it was all going to be over by, you know, it's a bit like the First World War, isn't it? It was all going to be over by Christmas. We'll be back to normal. And in November 2020, we realized it wasn't. So we agreed a 12-month strategy and started the work on what the new corporate strategy was going to look like. We recognized the world was changing as a result of COVID, but it was also changing just because of time. In fact, it ended up being a 16-month corporate strategy, and the board adopted a new corporate strategy last month, which we're just about to work out how to share all that information. I said the world has moved on, and actually I think the interesting point about voice standard needs to go in there, but actually We know we got catch-up repairs. We know we're still dealing with catch-up repairs. We know we got catch-up on planned works, planned investment. And of course, actually, there's a finite amount of money you're able to spend in each financial year. So the fact you didn't spend it 2 years ago doesn't mean it's sitting there waiting to be spent. Frustratingly, it's got to come out of the budget for that year and still meet all the covenants that we have with our banks, our funders, so we don't get into trouble. Decarbonisation. We've always talked for a long time about energy efficiency. We've always focused on energy efficiency. You know, Louise has focused incredibly on how we can improve the energy performance of each of our homes. But now we got this thing that by 2050, the government expect us to be net carbon zero, and the regulator expects us to be able to demonstrate in our business plan how we're going to achieve that. And that's a very big spend. I think Broadland, as I was saying to James earlier, we're in a better position than many because of our prior investment, although I'm really worried right now about building cost inflation and other inflation. But it's a very big bill. We know there's much more expected of us and required from us completely rightly on health and safety and building safety. And for the first time, we're recognising we really should have a 30-year development plan, not just a 5-year development plan. Up to now, all housing associations, we haven't been, you know, the outsider. All housing associations have assumed when they give a business plan to the regulator that after 5 years you turn off development. Because actually, if you don't develop any new homes, if you don't try to meet housing need by providing more, you very quickly get into a strong financial position. So you've always got a sound business plan. Now, the reality is if we're going to model decarbonisation through to 2050, we need to do it matched along development. And Ian and his team did a lot of work before Christmas with us to work out what our capacity was. Now, the fact is, I don't think before Christmas we expected inflation to go the way it is going. We've got general inflation reaching, what, 8%. Building cost inflation is well over 12.
I'll give you a bit of information. When I first moved into the flat, average over the year, it was £40 a month for my electricity, so my heating. Now I'm paying 140.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting really tight.
I have oil central heating. I got a delivery in January and I got a delivery last month, and it had gone up by exactly 100% in that short period. Glass, for example, is running at 20% inflation right now. So if you've got a program of new windows, suddenly that's become considerably more expensive. So that's been a big piece of work. I'm conscious that Richard's going to disappear in 8 minutes, so I've got to get through 8 slides. That's giving me a minute a slide. We've moved last summer to permanent hybrid working. So we consulted our staff team, and we've worked now to people much more being based at home if their circumstances are right. With the get out that actually, if you can't work from home, we will find a solution. Now, one of the benefits of that, interestingly, was surrendering half our head office at Carrow Road. And that saves about £133,000 a year in rent and service charge. So considerable financial benefit in doing that. But at the same time, you've got this issue about how you have culture, how you give you an example away from Broadland. I chair the Theatre Royal Trust, which is Theatre Royal Playhouse Stage 2 things in Norwich. In August of 2020, we made 170 staff redundant and reduced to a staff team of 35. We're now at a staff team of 233, which means 198 staff have not worked for us for very long. How do you ensure that the culture of the 198 is aligned to the 35, as opposed to the 198 deciding your new culture, and suddenly the culture you want isn't actually the prevalent culture? Now, put us into a home working solution. We've had about 35 new members of staff since the start of the first lockdown. How do you share culture if actually you're only meeting on Teams? So it's actually changing the way you work to know what's worth getting together for, which is more than just having a quick transactional meeting. What's the next slide? What's our hangover like? We're still catching up with the repairs backlog. A month or so ago, I was very optimistic, and then we ended up with lots of people getting COVID. And you only need one person going out for 1 week, and suddenly you've lost 25 jobs that they would have done that week on average. We know that I've already mentioned it, the delayed investment in tenants' homes, and that impacts our budgets and impacts business plan capacity, and that's a bit of a hangover. And at that point I was just making, still learning how to maintain culture when we're more geographically diverse because people are working from home, those that aren't in Broadland vans. The new normal, we are in a new normal, and I think it's worth admitting that we're not still in crisis management. We've managed to do some really quite great things in the last year or so. We achieved 2-star best companies. We still achieved gold SHIFT accreditation. SHIFT stands for Social Housing Index for Tomorrow, and it sort of looks at our green credentials. For the last 3 assessments, we were top in the country. Actually, we were second top this time, but still very good. Andrew and his team still built 283 homes. And this lovely green frame over here on the wall here is we've achieved our ESG housing sustainability certification, which doesn't sound very exciting. It's the one that they're not very exciting, except we are the first housing association with less than 40,000 homes to have achieved it. And that sort of shows what the core is, and that will actually feed in future years to us being able to borrow at more advantageous rates, which is good news as well. And something I completely forgot until I was reminded earlier today, we also passed our IDA in-depth assessment. So every 4 years, the regulator turns up. This time they turned up virtually as opposed to in the room, to go through the organisation and check us against their governance expectations and their money expectations. And we were G1 V2. G1 stands for governance, top grade. V2 stands for viability, second top, which is still compliant, but it just shows that we're stretched. It shows I actually, yeah, if we wanted to be V1, it's quite simple. We just get rid of Andrew's team, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And we say that actually the idea of meeting housing need and regarding people that need to be our tenants as equally important to people who are, isn't our priority anymore. I mean, broadly speaking, without sort of sharing too much here of the pain and agony, if you take a 2-bedroom flat at Canary Quay, it doesn't actually generate a positive income stream to the association until year 12 or 13 after construction. If you take a 3-bedroom house that we're building in Great Hockham, rented, it doesn't generate a positive income stream to the association for the first 22 to 23 years. So actually, that's at affordable rents. So if you just stop developing new homes, suddenly you haven't got this drain paying interest to banks, but you're not meeting your purpose.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about Carrot Court?
True.
Carrow Court,
Yeah.
that would have been Carrow Court. I haven't run the figures of Carrow Court, but I suspect that Carrow Court, which was built in what, 2007-8, is probably now just generating a small positive income stream.
Big wrong way.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Mary.
Yeah, how successful were you during the pandemic to letting property through video links? This I'm personally involved in. I rented my flat through a video link, which wasn't really very well. I thought at first it was okay, but I was just we interested in to see how successful you were letting property during the pandemic through a
I'm going to get
video
Steph to answer
link.
that, Mary.
Well, we
Right,
tried it
okay.
for the first time, I think is the answer. Like we did many things, is we tried it for the first time to see how it worked. And I think a mixture is what we got, a mixture of feedback. For some people, it worked well, but for some people, they really needed to see it in person. I think that's just different communication types. And some people need to see it in person, and I think that's the feedback we got. So what we don't do now is a one-size-fits-all, Mary. If someone wants to have their viewing in person, we'll do it in person. But actually, if someone works full time and actually they might say, I'm happy with the video, do that way. So very much around what people need and want.
I'm bearing in mind the taxi is probably already warming its engine to be here. I've got a couple more slides, just 2 or 3. What worries me about COVID now? It hasn't gone away. That is a map of the world, and the red areas are where less than 70% of the population have been vaccinated. My daughter, who's a health journalist, was in Madagascar looking at the famine. Can I just say, if Sarah Newey decides to come to visit you, it means you're in dire circumstances and say no. But she was in Madagascar in November reporting on the famine, and they received their first vaccines that were going to be sufficient to vaccinate 1.5% of the population. And as she points out, when you've got unvaccinated populations, you've got a major cause of new variants. And we may well have been lulled into this false sense of security by Omicron being relatively mild. I'm really worried. You know, I mentioned jet2.com. There's an incredible amount of complacency that we're out of it. And as I put at the bottom there, I don't think COVID has got the memo that it's supposed to have gone away. And I'm just
I mean, this
fearful.
one is far more contagious.
Yeah, I'm just fearful it will turn up and bite us in the whatsits.
I can't believe that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It is. And whereas, you know, I'm very grateful I've had 3 vaccinations. My parents-in-law have now had 4 vaccinations, but actually when you've got parts of the world with no vaccinations,
That doesn't feel right.
morally, it doesn't feel very good. Lessons for the future. I think always maintain the focus on people. I think we got that right. I don't think business continuity plans, I think they're worth something, but they're rarely the solution when you have a problem. In other words, in the same way, I remember talking to a bank once, NatWest, about 15 years ago, where they said, we know that every business plan that we look at from a housing association is going to be wrong. But the fact they can prepare a business plan gives us confidence that they can run the business when things go wrong. And I think business continuity plans are really useful to make sure you're thinking in the right way. But actually, when something like a pandemic comes along, or actually any of those events I had on that slide earlier, actually the fact that you can think it through and adapt quickly is fundamentally important.
Although a lot of businesses can't do that.
No, I know. I think
be a massive flaw in the UK.
Yeah. I put here moments of crisis need commitment, focus, and serenity. I decided serenity was the right word. Not panicking and running around like headless chickens. You know, and that meeting on the 23rd of March 2020, we had that commitment, we had that focus, we had that serenity, and we also had a lot of humour. And it was an interesting observation today. We've been having a governance review undertaken, which is coming to an end now by external consultants. We had a governance working party this morning, and they were reporting back how impressed they were that the boards across the group were able to have humour when dealing with serious issues. The relationships were right. You can't inform too much, but you have to be consistent in your communication. You can't zigzag around. Always explain, maximize openness and transparency. If you've got to make a difficult decision, explain to people why you've had to make it. Give them the facts, so it's not being done to them, but they're understanding it's being done with them. And I put this last bit, don't get frustrated outside our circle of control. There's a bit of training that we've done across the organisation, which talks about circle of concern and circle of influence. And the classic example, you're stuck in a traffic jam on the A47, that's very much in your circle of concern. You can't do anything about it. That's not in your circle of influence. And in the same way, for us, focus on what we can change. We can't, you know, we might rant and rave about what the government is or isn't doing, etc. We have no influence. It may be deeply satisfying ranting on social media, but it doesn't actually change anything. So as an organisation, know what you can control, know what you can influence, and focus on those. If we had had more financial and people resources in 2020, this was when I was doing my soul search, I was thinking, what would I have suggested we did differently? I think we would have extended our befriending calls, as I call them there, to anyone that wanted them, as opposed to having to prioritise people who we thought were potentially lonely, potentially isolated. I think there's something about, I don't know what the answer, and I know we didn't have the financial resources, about how we supported people, supported our tenants with younger children. Yeah, it's just, even volunteers takes tremendous organisation. Yeah, I mean, we've got about 190 volunteers that help us at the Theatre Royal, and it's almost a full-time job for somebody managing 190 people who want to volunteer. But, you know, how could we have supported tenants with younger children? Homeschooling was tough for parents and children alike. And actually, I'm sure there's been some really nightmare cases across the country of circumstances that went wrong. And I think we probably should have identified earlier how we could have made some of our office spaces safe, particularly for people who were struggling in the first lockdown to come into work in a safe way. But at the time, the guidance from the government was stay at home, and perhaps we all actually embraced that a bit too much. I mean, you should have found ways around it. But I have to say, you don't have to go back very long to know that you were really afraid of COVID in 2020. So I come back to my last slide, which is the one at the beginning, is if we were soul searching, the big question for all of us is, could we have done other things that would have made it easier over the last 2 years for our tenants, for our staff, and actually our other stakeholders? And I think that's got to be an open question that we keep thinking about. And I've used far too much time. So, but Richard's taxi is now already leaving.
Good. Okay, well, you'll miss my points then.
No, no.
I
Has it arrived, Paula?
was,
No, that's
I
all right.
was very engaged with them throughout the whole. Right. And I first of all want to say, through the prism of hindsight, there must be no blame attached. We all did our best. I think the problem we had was that the board and me, a tenant, we had different a priori perceptions. You saw the problems with the staff, the risk of making one mistake and the notoriety. I saw my tenants feeling abandoned, looking for a face of authority. Some of them are still in siege mentality as a result. So many things were missed. One of the crucial things was missed, that very young children couldn't play together. It's a new experience for them now, going into play. This pandemic affected absolutely everybody. And I felt that for me, I sat out through the pandemic for as long as I could every day. We had a tenant with a problem who needed support. They were happy to see friendly faces. There was a risk attached to that because people saw they've stopped and wanted to chat. So sometimes we had more than 4 and it was very difficult. But my feeling that all the time the tenants were on to me, we're feeling abandoned, what can we do? And of course the letters came, but not the faces. And this was the great problem they had. They felt alone and some of them have never recovered. So I think I can understand all this. And we did these different perceptions from the very beginning, which I think we understand.
I mean, it's a really valid point, and I remember feeling desperate at the time. If I'm honest, don't tell anyone, but my next door neighbour, but one was going through hell, medically and financially, and so we met in our garden, where the police couldn't see that we were meeting. At distance. Cressida Dick was interested, but she seems to have gone now. But I think, as an employer, your challenge as an employer is to ensure that you're not putting people at unnecessary risk. You know, in hindsight, I wish we could have found a different way. I think it's quite easy to forget how getting COVID was a real disaster in 2020. You know, the percentage of people that got hospitalised. But I do think the government got things wrong. I think we should have found different ways around it. I mean, this room is a success. It's an interesting success because actually, if you think about it, we could probably think of other ways that we could have done it in time elsewhere. So this room is a COVID secure meeting space. And at the meeting you were at, when we all got pinged by the app afterwards, I was sitting next to, I was sitting there and Cassia was sitting beside me, and Cassia got COVID the next day and tested positive, and I had to go into, was it 8 days or 9 days of quarantine?
Yeah. We all did.
But nobody caught it because the Perspex screens worked.
Yeah.
And actually we just didn't have that evidence early enough, you know, to how could we make it safe for staff to meet tenants more easily.
True. I should point out that despite by staying outside and people stopping, during that time nobody caught it in our place either.
Yeah, but nobody was bringing it in necessarily.
That's true.
Yeah.
Richard, your taxi's here. Your taxi's here. If it's if you had any finale moment.
No, I would like to
But I mean, I think that is a really valid point. And I think we've all got used to wearing masks. Well, actually, people seem to be forgetting that. But we've all got used to speaking through Perspex screens. And, you know, if we had our time again, I would have bought more Perspex, maybe.
And I think maybe we could have discussed our different perceptions a bit.
Yeah, we just, as an employer, you had to follow the government guidance. In fact,
As I always have
but
done.
you know, being completely honest, a member of staff who I don't think is with us anymore actually felt that that member of staff was being put at risk by being asked to go into tenants' homes, and reported us to the health and safety executive in 2020. And I was required to provide them with all the guidance and the circumstances with which we allowed staff to meet tenants, to get us off the hook, because otherwise they would have taken action against us, because we were not, as an employer, allowed to put staff at unnecessary risk. So there had to be that risk analysis. And
I tried to explain that to frighten tenants.
I
It was
absolutely,
very difficult.
yeah, I absolutely know that. And you know, it's why communication, you know, I put that slide earlier where I said, you know, we need to find ways of communicating with everybody on a push basis, as opposed to when they want to pull it from
I
us.
think we've all learned something.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Know a bit more
Yeah.
about it.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
My time management has been hopeless. We were supposed to finish by 7.
I'm glad somebody else is bad like me.
I kept getting interrupted, Gloria.
I know,
I'm not sure who by.
Yeah.
Now let me think about it.
I was wondering, should I do this or not?
But it's been an interesting
I've learned an
experience.
awful lot.
2 years. Yes.
From my opinion as a tenant, I had no criticism of the way the company dealt with COVID.
I wouldn't want to go through the experience again, I'll be honest. I'd be quite glad to get beyond COVID, but I have a feeling that this won't be the last pandemic that this country experiences.
Well, they say, don't they, in a few years, it'll become a flu.
Yeah, Sarah, my daughter, depressed me about a year ago by saying the evidence is that most pandemics take 3 to 5 years to go through before they become sort of endemic conditions.
And it is,
Which of course, we're only 2 years in to that 3 to 5 years.
but it is getting less. I mean, most people I know in the last few months who've had it have had far lower symptoms. But the big lesson, don't go near kids who go to school or nurseries.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Like the hospital now is in level 4 the other week, but there's a lot of people come to the hospital, but not really serious. So that is one thing that is, I think, vaccine really help.
It does. We almost lost my father-in-law in January to COVID. I've never seen anyone so ill. He's 91 now, and I've never seen anyone so ill in my life, actually.
I mean, I can say of the 2 doses I've had, I probably only had 1 day to 2 day where I felt really, really ill, to the point where I couldn't give a,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? But other than that, it's just been like a bad flu, really.
And one of the things we've got to be careful about is we don't end up with a group, a percentage of our population that, due to their vulnerabilities, are now totally excluded from society, because either it's actually unsafe for them, or they're so afraid, a bit of Richard's point, they're so afraid of re-engaging with everybody.
Well, my ex hasn't seen the grandchildren, the newborns. Oh, well, they're 2 years, 2 years old now, and he's not seen them, and that's because of the pandemic.
It's interesting that, you know, I think both Richard and James I shook hands with this evening. Interesting, after the Spanish flu, it took about 10 years for people to get back to shaking hands. So it does, you know, and I think that's what I sort of said earlier about there will be a psychological impact on everybody that's lived through the pandemic. You know, I'm old enough to remember, as somebody, some others may in this room, the doing my homework to candlelight in about 1972, 73.
Yeah.
And
It's
I
old enough to have been working at the
Yeah. And I still have I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but I still have a vivid memory of that. And that was only sort of sitting at the kitchen table with my 4 siblings doing homework. Now, if you think about kids who have been at primary school through all this, where, you know, we've got parents in the room with kids that have been through primary school, there will be an impact, whether we're aware of it now or not, on them. And I think everybody, at whatever stage of life, there's been an impact. It's,
I think that's the fact they younger.
Yeah.
Because their social skills
yeah,
are really wanting. Because they didn't have the opportunity to go to school.
well, some children went backwards over the last 2 years. They lost skills they had. Yeah. So I think there's going to be a long tail to this beyond the medical tail, the physical medical tail.
One thing that was a standout for me is my common community departments. The site of the Broadland van, and the guy getting out with the room gave us a feeling of normality.
And it was interesting because in that first month or so, the guys getting out with their lawnmowers were really terrified to be getting out with their lawnmowers. They felt that we were exposing them to a risk. And that was an interesting one because actually there were such bad news stories coming through I mean, it's why I gave up watching the 10 o'clock news. There were so many bad news stories. We were incredibly lucky as an organisation. So I think just before Christmas, early December, I'm looking at those people eating chocolate now. They didn't pass it round. Did you notice? But in early December 2021, we had the most staff off with COVID at any one time at 15. We had never got to 15 before. Interestingly, we've had quite a few weeks this year where we've been over 11. So whilst it might be milder, we've got many more people catching it.
Oh, it's still dangerous anyway for something.
But I think we did really, I have to say, we did remarkably well for 20 months. Not really. We've had one member of staff in 2020 that was hospitalised, and just one member of staff.
I can tell you one thing that was wonderful for me. No traffic going up and down Great Hill.
Yeah.
So it was quiet. It was free from pollution.
Yeah.
It was incredible. The difference was absolutely.
There were certain
amazing.
roads around me which I would never cycle on normally, which were totally safe as a result. I remember cycling on the Fakenham Road, if you know it, from Borswell up to Geist, one lorry came past me, and that was the only vehicle. I would never cycle on that road normally. So, you know, I think the important thing is that we all come out of this over time, trying to work out what were the good bits that need to be captured, as well as the bits that we really don't want to ever go through again, and we need to know how we would deal with in those circumstances, because I think some community values have become stronger.
Bye, Mary. Mary's off.
Mary, lovely to see you.
Bye.
Bye. Interesting question. I'm looking at Louise. The trouble is, I'm not completely convinced the government's guidance is necessary.
I don't think anybody is.
I think there's a political motivation, and it's a bit like getting on that flight last Thursday and suddenly really feeling very insecure with nobody wearing. Well, there were 4 other people on the flight, 180 people. 4 of us were wearing masks, and
Some feedback.
But my daughter was in Geneva with the World Health Organization last week, and BA are also no masks.
I'm amazed because, I mean, years back,
It's just so easy.
you always knew that you'd come back from a fantastic holiday and the odds of getting ill because of the germs that were, yeah.
So I just think, I don't think any of us should be paranoid, but I don't think we should be complacent either. It's about managing risk. And so I went on my way here today, I needed to collect some building sand, and I was the only person in B&Q on Boundary Road, I think, wearing a mask. But did I mind if somebody thought, well, he's a bit strange, he's wearing a mask? You know, I'm big enough and broad enough now not to worry about those opinions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I did my test this morning, I was negative, so I stopped up.
Yes, I'm going to run out at some point. I did 2 tests over the weekend because I didn't feel great having been on the plane. But
I mean, my sister was absolutely relieved to find out all 3 flights made people wear masks.
I think that's really important. I mean, I flew because I was speaking at the conference in Madrid. I flew Ryanair because that was the only way I could get down to Madrid and on to Gran Canaria and back to Stansted where my car was going to be. And actually, Ryanair, give credit where credit's due. I tried never to fly Ryanair, but you had to wear a mask, and you had to leave. You couldn't stand up at the end. It was row by row, and actually Jet2 still do that. The fact that everyone ignored it was.
That's really good, actually. It's big, they can't keep that.
Yeah, I just think
It's always
it's
a
so
nightmare.
sensible. So sensible. Right, it's 7:20. We said that this was going to be over by 7, so I do apologise for overrun.
Just to
The corporate strategy, yeah. We will now be cascading that. Theoretically, Paula, Laura and I were sitting down this afternoon to work that out. The fact we had technical problems here, which took 2.25 hours to set up the presentation, and we didn't do that. But we are meeting at the YMCA CAF tomorrow morning on Aylsham Road, lunchtime actually, isn't it? To work that one out, because we do want to cascade it. We want to make sure that we cascade it to tenants, to all our staff, stakeholders in a consistent but relatively plain English way. But I have to say again, I think this is the next iteration on from the 2019 one, and I think the board has spent more time concentrating and focusing on the development of this strategy than ever before, because we actually started the first away days down at Linford Hall in June last year, and the target was to get it completed by November, and actually there was that grown-up conversation both in November and January that actually we weren't quite there yet. We need to just do a bit more, which meant that it was probably a sounder strategy, and the fact that, okay, not the in-depth business planning that we're doing right now to go to the May board, but the fact that we did quite a lot of business planning scenarios in November, December, meant that we weren't coming up with ambitions that couldn't be funded. And I think that's the biggest focus right now, is what we can afford. The challenge is always going to be, if I'm completely honest, the net carbon zero, because and making sure that delivering decarbonisation, which is that sort of new word in the English dictionary, doesn't actually mean more expensive fuel bills for tenants. It's because energy efficiency and decarbonisation aren't the same thing, and you can actually deliver decarbonisation and make it more expensive to live in people's homes. So it's working out how we achieve that properly. Yeah, I mean, our stock is actually better than most other housing associations. That's been one of the most reassuring things.
the end of the day.
There will be some properties, for example, the property that Mary lives in Aylsham, will never be net carbon zero. It's grade 2 listed. We'll never get planning consent for the works that we would need to do to that property to make it net carbon zero. So actually, it's looking at the 5,500 homes and saying, can that get to a net carbon zero as a whole? Assuming that there will be some exemptions, but equally assuming that sooner or later, and probably not before 2031, 2032, the government will come up with some serious funding. Clive Betts, who's the chair of the select committee, I think you and I were on the same call, said that if the cost of decarbonisation was put on housing associations, every single housing association in the country would go bust. So sooner or later, the government had to and actually, I've heard some people say, well, they just put the target back to 2060 or 2070. Well, actually, that doesn't remove climate change, which is still going in the wrong direction. You know, he's a politician.
I was gonna say, do you believe that?
I feel it's something we in the whole Broadland housing and its residents.
I mean, it's one of the ways, you know, can't really call it, on top of roof where you,
PVs and so.
yeah.
No,
I
I
mean,
mean,
in a place like Carrow Court, I mean,
It's part of it. And actually, the other thing to assume, and you have to assume this, and it's not just the get out of jail card, is technology will change. You know, technology has changed hugely in the last 20, 25 years. And technology will change going forward. I remember, you know, Yvette Cooper saying in about 2005-6, when she was housing minister, which would be about then, I think, that, you know, she was convinced that sooner or later somebody would invent the magic wallpaper that actually did deliver the insulation required inside. She was particularly concerned about terrace properties, where actually if you put a couple of inches of insulation on the inside room, you actually made the rooms too small really to be a decent habitable space. And actually that sort of thing is beginning to come through. So we need to have a plan. We need to have a costed plan, but we also need to make some assumptions that over the years things will change. But I have to say, right now, building cost inflation is running so much faster than ordinary CPI and RPI. That's our biggest concern. How we make that investment and still invest in the responsive and planned maintenance that will, you know, the reality is a new kitchen, bathroom means an awful lot more to the resident than a new roof or something like that. And we've got to balance those priorities.
Building regs still going at pace, so that's quite interesting. That's the first sign of something stopping. When they stop that building reg policy starts moving backwards, it's still going at the moment. So you know, until that changes, I think, I know that's new build, but it normally leads that policy way. There's a long way to go on existing though, as Luke just tell you, but yeah, it's quite interesting that hasn't stopped. And if it was going to stop, I would have thought, looking at what's coming in the next year, I would have thought it might have stopped by now, which is quite interesting because that's what happened in 2016. So it stopped. So
Carrow Court, you did a fantastic job on insulation and soundproofing. I know I've had other reasons to moan, but I mean, on those two basic things, I never hear my name.
It's there's occasionally a development scheme that we refer to as a CPD scheme, which stands for Continuing Professional Development. I think Andrew and the development team decided that Carrow Court was going to be the CPD scheme for, so what's it, 49 flats with 49 different layouts, you know, completely illogical. And it was almost by accident that we discovered that it was incredibly airproof.
yeah, it wasn't by accident. It's concrete floor, so we put more soundproofing in that one just to see how that would work.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing.
Plus 15, I think, % over building regs at the time.
Well, we tried it out, my neighbour on the corner, who's right beside me, our lounges back. And we both put our music on to the point I couldn't bear it. Couldn't hear them, they couldn't hear me.
That was SIP infill. I think we did on there, didn't we? SIP infill, so it's very energy efficient in terms of warmth.
I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, you imagine a £40 a month average out the whole year, which is what it was for quite a few, you know, obviously now it's gone
Energy
ridiculous.
costs just horrendous.
That's the 2008, 2009 build. See, so that was on building regs 2003, 4 probably. It's amazing, isn't it? Even at that point in time where it was going, and then it just stopped. 16 years later.
What about the new ones that you've done, you know?
Carrow Court, Carrow Key.
Yeah,
The EPCB, they're airtight again, so that means we're not losing a lot of heat and energy out. We had to put mechanical ventilation in some of them.
They got too hot.
Too airtight.
I was going to say I only have one complaint, and that's when we have the hot weather. So
Yeah, that's the only trouble.
it goes up to 25, and there's just no way.
Yeah, and that's the
Get it
big
down.
problem with those buildings, is the overheating issues.
But I'd rather that than be cold.
Yeah, but the amount of year, I just hope over the years though, the whole point of climate change is getting hotter. So we'll have to see where that level.
Well, I'll have to invest in a
Looking forward to my air source.
air conditioner.
Good,
That will provide me with cooler air.
yeah,
Cooler
Yeah.
radiators.
Radiators.
It's hot weather.
it will certainly be cooler radiators, that's for sure.
I think we ought to stop. It's 7:30.